Helen Ellie Montgomery stood in the kitchen of her home, her eyes tracing the familiar contours of the old oak cabinets, the worn countertop where countless meals had been prepared, and the chipped paint on the walls, each imperfection holding a memory. At 69, she felt a sense of pride in the home she had built from nothing with her late husband, Andrew Montgomery. Their journey had been long and filled with struggle, but it was also marked by an unwavering commitment to each other and their dream. They started with 2 suitcases, a baby in Helen's arms, and a world of uncertainty. But through the years, through hard labor and sacrifices, they'd built this house brick by brick, piece by piece. Andrew was gone now, a memory etched into the walls of their home, but Helen was still here, holding onto their dream, holding onto the house. It was all she had left of him. The foundation they laid together, the dreams they built together, were hers to protect now. And yet, lately, something had begun to change. Ethan Montgomery, her son, the boy she raised with love and care, the boy who once ran to her for advice, now seemed like a stranger in her own home. Their relationship had always been close, strong, and full of understanding. But since Ethan married Sophia Montgomery, something had shifted, and not for the better. At first, it was subtle, small remarks here and there about the house, the furniture, even the way Helen liked to keep things in a particular order. But now, it was something more. Helen had always known change was inevitable. Her son had grown up, moved on, found a life of his own. But this wasn't the kind of change she had envisioned. It was as if he had turned into someone she didn't quite recognize anymore, someone who had begun to prioritize Sophia over everything they had once shared. She tried to ignore it, told herself that it was just the growing pains of a mother letting go. But as Ethan's defensiveness toward Sophia grew, as his disregard for Helen's feelings became clearer, Helen couldn't deny it anymore. A sense of disbelief washed over her as she thought about the last few weeks. Was it truly happening? Was Ethan, her son, her pride and joy, really siding with Sophia, a woman who had never truly understood the sacrifices Helen had made for her family? It was more than just an emotional shift. It felt like a betrayal. Helen could feel the tension building in her own home, the walls that had once been filled with warmth and laughter now thick with silence. She didn't know how to fix it, but one thing was for sure. The house she'd built with so much love now felt colder, distant. And in that silence, she could already hear the echoes of a change that would shake everything she thought she knew about family, loyalty, and love. Helen's first impression of Sophia Montgomery wasn't as warm as she'd hoped. At first, she had tried to be open-minded. After all, Ethan had chosen her, and Helen wanted nothing more than to see her son happy. But there was something about Sophia that unsettled her. It wasn't just the polished exterior or the way she always seemed to look at their modest home with an almost imperceptible disdain. It was the small things, the subtle remarks, and the way Sophia's eyes would scan the rooms, as though she were assessing a space far beneath her standards. Helen remembered the first time Sophia came over for dinner after their wedding. The evening had started off well enough, with polite conversation, but there was an undercurrent Helen couldn't ignore. Sophia criticized the homemade bread, calling it a bit too crusty, and remarked that the stew was heavier than she was used to. Helen, who had spent hours preparing the meal, felt her heart sink at each comment. But she smiled through it, telling herself that Sophia was just being honest, that perhaps she was used to different things. Still, each comment made Helen feel more like a guest in her own kitchen, more like an outsider in her own home. Then the changes started. At first, they were small. Sophia moved Helen's favorite vase, claiming it looked better on the shelf by the window. Helen didn't say anything at first, chalking it up to Sophia being new and perhaps wanting to put her mark on things. But then Sophia rearranged the living room, shifting furniture that had been in place for years, without asking Helen for her opinion. She replaced the family photos on the walls with her own, leaving little space for Helen's memories, and even decided to change the curtains from the soft beige Helen had chosen to a bright, bold green that clashed with everything. Every time Helen walked into the room, she felt as though her home was no longer hers. It wasn't just the physical changes. It was the way Sophia acted, as if nothing in the house was sacred, as if nothing Helen had built or loved mattered. She began to feel invisible, a stranger in her own space, as if she were no longer the matriarch of the home she had poured her soul into. And it wasn't just the house. Ethan had started to defend Sophia at every turn, brushing off Helen's concerns with a simple, "Mom, she's just trying to help," or "It's her way of making things feel like home too." Helen could feel the subtle shift in his behavior. The son she had raised, who once asked for her advice and relished their time together, now seemed distant, preoccupied with Sophia's every wish and complaint. Helen could almost hear the silent promises he made to his wife, as if her happiness were now his sole priority. Helen felt a growing distance between them. The mother-son bond, once unbreakable, now felt strained, stretched thin by Sophia's presence. It wasn't just the small criticisms or the changes to the house. It was the way Ethan was starting to choose Sophia over her, time and time again. He would always side with Sophia when Helen raised a concern, making Helen feel as though her opinions didn't matter, as though her years of hard work and sacrifice were now invisible. The cracks were starting to show. Sophia wasn't just changing the house, she was slowly but surely changing Ethan, and with him, the very foundation of Helen's family. The love and respect she had built her life around were slipping away, piece by piece, as Sophia's quiet disregard for everything Helen held dear began to take root. Helen sat quietly at the kitchen table, her hands folded in front of her as the steam from her coffee swirled in the air. Her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, each one pulling her in a different direction. She glanced at the family portraits on the wall, once filled with memories of laughter and love, but now they only reminded her of what she was losing. Ethan, her beloved son, the child she had raised with everything she had, was slipping further and further away from her. It had all started so innocently, small things that could have been overlooked, brushed aside as nothing more than the growing pains of a new marriage. Sophia's comments on the house, her desire to rearrange furniture, the subtle way she made Helen feel like an outsider in her own home. Helen had tried to be patient, tried to tell herself that everything would be okay. But now, it was different. Ethan had changed. He had become someone she didn't recognize, someone who would rather defend Sophia's actions than hear his own mother out. The first time it happened, Helen was shocked. Sophia had moved her prized rose bush from the front yard, claiming it was taking up too much space. When Helen had asked her not to, Ethan stepped in, his voice harsh and defensive, telling Helen she was being unreasonable. "Mom, just let her do it. She wants the garden to look nice too," he'd said, as though her years of tending to the plants meant nothing. Helen's heart had dropped that day. It was the first time she had felt like her own son didn't stand by her, the first time he had chosen Sophia's comfort over hers. It wasn't just the garden, though. It was the constant stream of small betrayals. Every time Sophia made a dismissive comment about the food Helen cooked, every time Ethan sided with her instead of hearing Helen out, a little more of Helen's heart broke. She had spent her life making sure her children never wanted for anything. She had given up her own dreams, worked late into the night sewing clothes for others, and even sold pies just to make ends meet. And after Andrew's tragic death, she had done it all alone, raising Ethan and Jacob without complaint, working tirelessly to build a future for them. She had sacrificed everything for them. Ethan's education had come at the cost of her own well-being. She had sold her beloved sewing machine, the one piece of independence she had, just so Ethan could have the education she never had. She had stayed up late, ironing clothes for others, while Ethan studied in the next room, oblivious to the pain in his mother's hands. She had worked tirelessly, day after day, so that Ethan could be an engineer, so that he could have a life that was better than hers. And now, all of that seemed forgotten. Ethan had changed in a way that felt like a betrayal of everything Helen had done for him. It wasn't just the house. It was the way Ethan no longer seemed to care about the sacrifices she had made, the way he refused to stand by her side when Sophia disregarded her feelings. It was as if Sophia had taken over his heart, pushing Helen aside with each passing day. Helen felt the weight of her loneliness settle in. It wasn't just that she was alone in her house. It was that Ethan, her son, the boy who used to run to her for comfort, was now the one keeping his distance. He no longer asked her how her day was. He no longer sat with her in the evenings, sharing their small joys. It was as though he had moved on, and in doing so, had forgotten the woman who had given him everything. Her heart ached with the realization that no matter how much she tried to keep peace, No matter how much she tried to understand Sophia, it was impossible to ignore the growing divide between her and her son. Helen's internal conflict deepened. She wanted to have peace in her home, but at what cost? Ethan's happiness was important to her, but so was her dignity, her sense of self-respect. How could she continue to watch Ethan defend Sophia, knowing that in doing so, he was disrespecting everything she had worked for? The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. Ethan had always been her pride and joy, the one child who had never given her trouble. And now, it felt as though he was slipping away from her, choosing Sophia over the mother who had given up everything for him. Helen sighed, wiping away a tear that had escaped her eye. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep sacrificing herself for a family that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of respect. The painful truth sank in. This wasn't just about Sophia anymore. This was about Ethan, and whether or not he would ever understand the depth of his mother's love and sacrifice. The morning sun filtered softly through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the house that had once felt like a sanctuary. But today, the warmth felt hollow, empty, as if even the light knew something was wrong. Helen stood at the sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, her mind miles away. She had spent the past few hours tending to her plants, something that always brought her peace. The garden was her little slice of joy, a place where she could escape the tensions building in her home. But today, as she stepped outside to admire the flowers she'd carefully nurtured for years, her heart sank. The roses she'd spent months coaxing to life were now haphazardly shoved to the far corner of the yard. The delicate jasmine that had taken root beside the old wooden fence was gone, replaced by a cold metal chair and an unfamiliar table. Her prized hydrangeas, once vibrant and thriving, were now in the shade, struggling in a corner where the sunlight barely reached. Sophia had moved everything, completely disregarding Helen's careful arrangements. Helen's chest tightened as she stood there, frozen in disbelief. She had asked Sophia time and time again to respect her space, to respect the things she had worked so hard for. But now, even her garden, the one thing she had left from the life she and Andrew Montgomery had built, had been turned into a battleground. Without thinking, she marched into the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Sophia in the living room, lounging on the couch with a magazine, her feet propped up on the coffee table. The sight made Helen's blood boil. It wasn't just that Sophia had rearranged the garden. It was the sheer arrogance, the lack of care, and the complete disregard for Helen's feelings. It was as if Sophia had come into this house and claimed it as her own, erasing everything Helen had lovingly built. "Helen," Sophia's voice was casual, almost bored as she glanced up from her magazine. "What's wrong? You look upset." Helen's eyes flashed with anger. "What did you do to my garden?" Her voice shook with barely contained rage. "You moved everything. You changed everything, without asking me, without even a word of respect." Sophia shrugged, her expression unfazed. "I just thought it looked better this way. I wanted to make the space more functional, for when we have people over." Helen took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the hurt was too deep. "Those plants are my memories, Sophia, every one of them. I've cared for them for years. They're not just decorations. They're part of this home, my home." But Sophia only gave her a condescending smile. "Well, maybe it's time to make some changes around here. It's not like it's just your home anymore. Ethan and I live here too." The words hit Helen like a slap. Sophia's dismissive tone, the casual way she spoke about her home, the home Helen had built with her own 2 hands, was more than Helen could bear. It was as if all those years of sacrifice, of building this life with Andrew, had been erased with one offhand comment. She turned to Ethan, who had been quietly standing in the doorway, watching the exchange unfold. His silence stung more than anything. He had always been her protector, her partner in this home, the one who understood her sacrifices. But now he stood there, his arms crossed, his eyes avoiding hers. "Ethan," Helen said, her voice trembling with hurt, "why aren't you saying anything? This is my house, my garden. You know how much it means to me. Why are you letting her do this?" Ethan finally spoke, but his voice was cold, distant, and something in it sent a chill down Helen's spine. "Mom, you're overreacting. It's just some plants. Sophia was only trying to make things better. You're always so stuck in the past, and it's not helping anyone. The words stung, and Helen felt the air leave her lungs. This wasn't just about the garden anymore. Ethan wasn't defending her. He wasn't standing up for her the way he used to. The son she had raised, the son she had sacrificed everything for, had just thrown her aside, all to defend Sophia, a woman who didn't respect her, didn't appreciate her, and it seemed had no intention of ever trying. Helen's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She had shed enough tears in this house. She wasn't going to let Sophia and Ethan see her weak. "So, that's it then," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You've chosen her. You've chosen Sophia over me." Ethan looked at her, his face hardened, the expression of the son she once knew gone. "I haven't chosen anyone, Mom. I'm just trying to live my life. You need to understand that things change. We're a family now." A family? The words cut deeper than anything. Helen Montgomery had spent her whole life building a family, and now the very concept of it was slipping away. Ethan had always been her pride, her joy, the one person who understood everything she'd gone through. But now it felt like he was abandoning her, siding with the woman who had done nothing but disrespect everything she had worked for. Helen's heart shattered in that moment. She knew it was over. This was the breaking point. The line had been crossed. And as she stood there, facing her son, the realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. Ethan had chosen Sophia. With that thought, something inside Helen snapped. The years of sacrifice, the late nights, the hard work, the love and care she had poured into Ethan, it all felt meaningless now. Sophia had won. She had taken everything that was supposed to be Helen, and Ethan had let her. The mother-son bond that had once been unbreakable had been torn apart in an instant. Helen turned away from Ethan, her heart heavy with betrayal. She couldn't stay in this house any longer, not with this new version of her son, not when everything she had built had been trampled underfoot. As she walked away, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Helen sat alone in the quiet of her living room, the weight of her heartache pressing down on her like an anchor. The house, which had once been a symbol of love, sacrifice, and family, now felt like a prison. The silence was deafening, echoing with the harsh words Ethan had said, the coldness in his eyes, and the devastating truth that had shattered everything she believed about her relationship with her son. Her mind raced as she thought back to all the years she had spent working tirelessly to create a life for her family. The nights she had stayed up late sewing clothes for others to make ends meet. The long hours she had spent baking pies just to scrape by. Every dollar she had earned had gone into this house. She had built this life with Andrew, brick by brick, sweat and tears mingling into the foundation of their home. But now, it felt like Ethan and Sophia had come in and torn it apart without a second thought. Helen's eyes glanced at the door, imagining Ethan and Sophia walking in and out as they pleased, as if they still had every right to this space, even though they no longer treated it with the respect it deserved. She could feel the emotional weight of their absence, the betrayal, and the helplessness that had consumed her for weeks. It was overwhelming. But as the sun began to set, Helen made a choice. She was done. She was done feeling like a guest in her own home. She was done being the woman who quietly accepted disrespect in silence. This house had been hers long before Ethan and Sophia walked through the door, and it would remain hers, no matter how many attempts they made to take it from her. With a sudden surge of determination, Helen picked up her phone and dialed a number she had never thought she would need. The locksmith answered quickly, his voice steady and professional. "I need to change the locks on my house," Helen said, her voice calm, though her heart was pounding. "I need it done as soon as possible." It wasn't an easy decision. The weight of it hung heavy on her chest. She could already feel the rift it would create. Ethan would be furious, Sophia would likely see it as a declaration of war, and the pain would only deepen. But the thought of staying silent, of allowing them to continue walking all over her, was no longer an option. The locksmith assured her he would be there in an hour. Helen hung up, her hands trembling slightly as she set the phone down. She walked slowly to the front door and turned the handle, staring at the lock as though it were the key to her future. It was funny, in a way. This small, simple act of changing the locks felt like the first step she had taken toward regaining control of her own life. The minutes ticked by, and soon the locksmith arrived. As he worked, Helen stood in the background, her emotions swirling. There was a strange sense of relief in this decision, a feeling of strength she hadn't realized she still had inside her. She was taking back what was rightfully hers. She wasn't going to let Ethan and Sophia trample all over the life she had fought for so hard. Yet at the same time, Helen knew there would be consequences. Ethan would be hurt, angry, confused. Sophia would likely escalate things, and the pain of losing her son in this way would weigh on Helen's heart for a long time. She wasn't blind to the emotional cost of her actions, but it was a sacrifice she was willing to make if it meant keeping her dignity intact. When the locksmith finished and handed her the new set of keys, Helen's fingers brushed over them with a sense of finality. The house was now completely hers, locked away from the people who had forgotten what it meant to respect her. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of something, hope maybe, or at least the beginning of peace. Helen took a deep breath, her heart heavy but steady. She was reclaiming her life, piece by piece. She was no longer going to let Ethan and Sophia dictate the terms of her happiness. The road ahead would be hard, and the emotional cost would remain, but she had made her choice. This was her home, her life, and no one was going to take that away from her. The sun had long set by the time Ethan Montgomery arrived home. His car pulled up to the driveway, the headlights cutting through the darkness, but something felt off. The house looked the same, yet the air seemed different, charged with an unfamiliar tension. He stepped out, glancing at the front door, his hand reaching for his key, but the lock wouldn't turn. At first, he thought maybe it was just a trick of the light, that the key had somehow slipped or jammed. But as he tried again, the truth settled in like ice water. The door was locked. Helen had changed the locks. A rush of panic surged through him. The house, his home, had always been a place where he could retreat, a sanctuary of comfort and familiarity. But now he was standing on the outside, the place he had once shared with his mother now completely out of reach. His pulse quickened as he banged on the door, his knuckles scraping against the wood with urgency. "Mom," he called, his voice desperate. "Mom, open the door." There was no answer. His breath came in short, frantic bursts, and he stepped back, surveying the house as if it might somehow give him an answer. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the driveway, but there was no movement inside. His phone was already in his hand, the screen lighting up as he dialed his mother's number for what felt like the 100th time. Helen's voicemail picked up. He called again. Voicemail. And again. His frustration mounted with each failed attempt, the sound of the phone ringing growing louder in his ears. "Mom, please pick up," he muttered to himself, panic creeping into his voice. "What's going on? Why are you doing this? It's just a misunderstanding. We can talk about it." But his mother didn't pick up. She didn't respond. Ethan's mind raced as he paced the front steps. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were family. This was his home too, and he couldn't understand why she was treating him like an outsider. Sophia had told him he needed to fix things with his mother, but all he could see now was the stone-cold silence that stretched between them, a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. A wave of guilt crashed over him. Helen had been nothing but supportive her whole life. She had sacrificed everything for him, for both him and Jacob Montgomery. And yet now, with just a few harsh words, their world had unraveled. He had chosen Sophia, had defended her, and now he was paying the price for it. He dialed his mother's number again, this time with a different tone in his voice. His frustration was turning into something else, fear, perhaps, or maybe desperation. "Mom, please," he said, his voice quivering. "I'm outside. I need to get my stuff. You can't do this. You can't just lock me out like this." The silence that followed felt suffocating, like a weight pressing down on his chest. No response. Only the soft hum of the night air, the distant sound of passing cars, the faint rustle of leaves in the trees. Ethan's stomach churned. This wasn't just about the plants anymore. It wasn't about who moved the furniture or which curtains were hung in the living room. This was about something much deeper, the breaking of a bond that had once been unbreakable. He was no longer the son who had a place in his mother's home. He was a man, and with that came choices. Sophia's words echoed in his head. "If you don't choose me, Ethan, you'll lose everything." The weight of her ultimatum pressed down on him, but it wasn't just her fault. He had chosen this. He had allowed himself to be swept away by his wife's demands and disregarded the woman who had given him everything. And now he was paying for it. His phone rang again. Helen's name flashed on the screen. His heart leapt. This was it. She was finally going to talk to him. Maybe they could work this out, maybe they could fix it. He answered quickly, his voice shaky. "Mom." A cold silence on the other end. And then, softly, her voice, tinged with a sadness he hadn't heard in years. "You don't get it, do you, Ethan?" Helen's words were quiet, but they hit him like a slap. "I can't keep letting you walk all over me. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay when you've completely disrespected me in my own house. This is my home, Ethan, and you've forgotten that." Her words stung, each one like a needle threading through his heart. She was right. She was so right, and yet he didn't know how to fix it. "Mom, please," he pleaded again. "I just want to get my things. I don't know what to do. I don't know what's happening between us. I'm so sorry." But Helen didn't soften. Her voice remained firm, quiet but resolute. "You can't just say sorry, Ethan. This is more than that. I've been trying to be patient to understand. But you've chosen Sophia. You've chosen her over me, over everything we built together. I can't pretend it's okay anymore." Ethan stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, the guilt heavy on his chest. He was losing his mother. He was losing the one person who had always been there for him, no matter what. "I'll leave the key under the mat for you," Helen said finally, her voice quiet but unyielding. "But you need to know something, Ethan. You can't come back here, not until you understand what's really important. Not until you figure out what it means to respect the people who love you." Her words pierced him like a dagger. This was it, the final line. Ethan Montgomery had crossed it, and now there was no going back. He stayed on the phone for a few more moments, the air thick with unsaid words. Then, without another word, Helen hung up. Ethan stared at the screen of his phone, his heart heavy, his mind reeling. He couldn't believe it. He had lost her. He had lost Helen, and now all he had left was Sophia. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. This moment, the moment when Helen had shut the door on him, would change everything. And he didn't know how to fix it. Helen sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, though the warmth didn't reach her heart. The house felt quieter than ever. The silence that once felt comforting now seemed to press in on her from all sides. Ethan had been gone for days, not returning her calls, not showing up at the house, and it left a hole in her chest that she wasn't sure how to fill. The weight of the situation seemed too much to bear. She had made her choice, to stand her ground, to reclaim her dignity. But the cost of that choice was clear. Ethan was hurt, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself it was for the best, the guilt gnawed at her. She had spent so many years nurturing that bond, building a life with Ethan, that now it felt like that life was slipping through her fingers. But just when the isolation of that thought was threatening to consume her, the doorbell rang. Helen stood up slowly, wiping away a tear before walking to the door. She opened it, and there stood Jacob Montgomery, her younger son. He was taller than she remembered, his face marked with the quiet confidence of a man who had found his own way in the world. But his eyes were filled with something softer, something that reminded her of the boy who used to run to her with scraped knees, asking for comfort. "Hey, Mom," Jacob said, offering a warm smile that didn't quite reach her heart but still gave her a sense of solace. "Can I come in?" Without a word, Helen stepped aside, and Jacob entered, taking off his jacket and hanging it on the hook by the door. He was quiet for a moment, surveying the room as though he could sense the tension in the air, the unspoken words that hovered between them. "Ethan's still not answering," Jacob asked gently, though the question didn't need to be asked. They both knew the answer. "No," Helen replied, her voice strained. "I haven't heard from him since the night I changed the locks. It's like he's disappeared." Jacob nodded, but instead of retreating into silence like she expected, he moved to sit beside her at the table. He placed a hand on hers, a gesture of reassurance that Helen found unexpectedly comforting. "Mom," he said, his voice steady, I just want you to know that you did the right thing. I know this isn't easy, but you had to do it. I know Ethan's angry, but he'll come around." Helen looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I don't know, Jacob. I feel like I've lost him. I never thought it would come to this. I thought we had an understanding." "We did," Jacob said, his tone soft but firm. "But Ethan has changed. And I hate to say it, but it's not just Sophia's influence. There's something deeper going on with him. He's lost sight of what matters, respect, family, the things you taught him all those years. I'm sorry, Mom, but you had to set boundaries. I know you're hurting, but if you didn't do it, you'd only be letting him walk all over you. Again." Helen closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. She had spent her entire life giving her sons everything, her love, her strength, her sacrifices. But now, it seemed like the very foundation of that love was being tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I just don't know if I can fix this," she whispered, the weight of the loss crashing down on her. "I can't keep going like this. I'm stuck between two people I love." Jacob squeezed her hand, his expression resolute. "I'm not asking you to fix it all at once, Mom. I know this is hard, but I think you made the right choice. Ethan is too wrapped up in defending Sophia to see how much you've done for him. And that's on him, not you. You've done everything you could for him. And if he doesn't see that, it's his loss." Helen looked at Jacob, his words bringing her a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in days. She was grateful for him, grateful that, despite everything, one of her sons was still standing by her side, showing her what it meant to live by principles of respect and loyalty. But as much as Jacob's support meant to her, there was still a pain in her heart. Ethan was still her son. No matter what, she couldn't erase the years they had spent together, the bond they had shared. She could feel the rift growing wider every day, and it terrified her. Jacob was right. This was no longer just about Sophia. It was about Ethan, and about whether he could find his way back to the family he had once held so dear. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the separation wasn't just physical, it was emotional. And Ethan, as angry and defensive as he was, had made it clear that he had chosen Sophia. But Helen couldn't change that. She had done her part. The rest now was up to him. "Thank you, Jacob," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Jacob smiled, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me, Mom. I'm your son. I'm always going to be here for you." Helen nodded, though she knew the battle ahead was far from over. The rift between her and Ethan was deepening by the day, and though Jacob was a comfort, he couldn't bridge the gap between mother and son. That was something Ethan would have to do on his own. But for now, Helen knew she had made the right decision. She had set her boundaries. She had done the hard thing, and as painful as it was the only way to preserve her dignity. Helen was sitting in the living room, the weight of the past few days heavy on her chest. She had been holding her ground, staying firm in her decision, keeping her emotions at bay. But deep down, the loneliness still gnawed at her. Ethan's silence, the absence of his presence in the house, had left a hollow space in her heart. She knew the separation was necessary, but it didn't make the pain any less real. The doorbell rang, snapping Helen out of her thoughts. She stood up slowly, wondering who could possibly be at the door at this hour. As she opened it, standing in front of her was a woman she recognized from photos, Sophia's sister, Jessica Parker. She stood with a tight smile on her face, her posture straight and confident, almost as if she were about to enter a boardroom, not a home fraught with tension. "Hello, Mrs. Montgomery," Jessica said, her tone polite but with a touch of forced sweetness. "I'm Jessica, Sophia's sister. I was hoping we could talk for a moment." Helen's heart sank. She had been expecting something like this, but that didn't make it any easier. She nodded slowly, stepping aside to allow Jessica to enter. The moment she crossed the threshold, Helen could feel the weight of the situation shifting. Jessica was here on a mission, and she had no intention of leaving without getting what she wanted. They sat down across from each other in the living room, the space feeling suddenly smaller, more charged. Jessica wasted no time in launching into her carefully rehearsed speech. "First of all," she began, her voice smooth, almost too polished, "I just want to say that I understand this has been difficult for you. Ethan and Sophia both have been so upset, you know. They miss you terribly. Ethan especially. He's really struggling with this. I think it's important that we talk and try to resolve this before things get worse." Helen didn't respond immediately, instead studying Jessica's face. There was no hint of true sympathy in her eyes, only a practiced look of concern that felt hollow. It was as if she was reading from a script she had written for herself, one that didn't acknowledge the real pain Helen had been feeling. She could already tell that Jessica wasn't here to understand her side of things. She was here to push a narrative, to make Helen feel guilty. "Sophia and Ethan are just trying to start a new life together, Mrs. Montgomery," Jessica continued, her words dripping with a false sense of reason. "They're young. They want to be happy. And this whole situation, well, it's not good for anyone. I'm sure you don't want to see your sons suffering like this." Helen felt the sting of the words, but she kept her face neutral. She wasn't about to let Jessica manipulate her into feeling responsible for the mess her son had gotten himself into. "I'm not the one making them suffer," Helen replied, her voice calm but firm. "The choices they're making, Ethan, especially, are his to bear. I'm not responsible for their problems." Jessica leaned forward slightly, her expression changing to one of subtle condescension. Of course, but you have to understand, it's not that simple. Ethan is just caught between his loyalty to you and his commitment to Sophia, and it's putting a strain on their marriage. Sophia has been so patient with all of this, but it's hard for her too, you know." The implication was clear. Sophia was the victim here, and Helen was somehow the one in the wrong for demanding respect. Jessica was trying to make Helen feel guilty for defending her own boundaries, for standing up for the home she had built. "I'm sorry, but that's not my problem," Helen said, her voice hardening. "Sophia isn't the one who has spent the last 30 years building this house, this life. I'm not going to apologize for standing up for what's mine." Jessica raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, I see. Well, I suppose you're entitled to feel that way, but let's be realistic here. This house, it's just bricks and mortar. What's more important is family. Ethan is your son, and I know you love him. But you have to ask yourself, do you want him to be happy, or do you want to keep fighting over a few changes in the house?" Helen's fists clenched at her sides, but she kept her composure. The audacity of Jessica's words was staggering. She was trying to guilt her into believing that Ethan's happiness was worth more than the respect he owed her as a mother. Helen had given Ethan everything. She had sacrificed everything for him. And now, Jessica was asking her to just forget all of that, to simply let it go for the sake of peace. "No one is asking you to give up your house, Helen," Jessica continued, her voice growing softer, more persuasive. "But don't you think it's time to let go of the past? Let Ethan and Sophia live their lives. Let them be happy. The longer you hold on to this, the more it will tear your family apart." Helen's heart thundered in her chest, but she was resolute. "My family isn't the one tearing itself apart, Jessica," she said firmly, her gaze unwavering. "It's the people who don't understand the value of respect, respect for the past, respect for the people who have sacrificed for them. Ethan doesn't need to choose between me and Sophia, but he does need to choose whether he'll show respect for the people who have loved him, who have always had his back. I can't force him to see that. He has to decide for himself." Jessica fell silent, her expression hardening slightly as she realized she wasn't getting through to Helen. "Well, I tried," she said, her voice dripping with the same false sweetness. "But I guess you've made up your mind." Helen didn't respond. She simply stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "I've made up my mind," she said quietly, "and nothing you say is going to change that." Jessica stood up, looking almost disappointed. "I understand, but I'll tell Sophia that you're not willing to talk. I guess we'll have to figure this out on our own." With a stiff nod, Jessica turned and walked toward the door, pausing only to glance back at Helen. "I hope you'll reconsider, Helen, for Ethan's sake." Helen didn't say anything as she watched Jessica leave, the door clicking shut behind her. The room was silent once again. But this time, the silence felt different. It was her silence. It was the silence of someone who had finally set boundaries, someone who had chosen dignity over compromise. It was late in the evening when the phone rang, its sudden sound cutting through the stillness of Helen's quiet house. The last few days had been a blur of emotions: grief, anger, loneliness. since Ethan left without a word. She hadn't heard from him since their confrontation, and though she had told herself she wasn't going to wait for him to come back, she couldn't help the flicker of hope that ignited when the phone lit up with his name. She hesitated for a moment, staring at the screen. She had told herself this would happen, that Ethan would eventually reach out, that he would come to his senses. But a part of her also knew that his call would be painful, that whatever he said wouldn't be enough to fix what had been broken between them. Still, she pressed accept, her heart hammering in her chest. "Mom," Ethan's voice on the other end was raw, heavy with emotion. "Mom, it's me." Helen's stomach twisted. She hadn't heard him sound like this in years, so vulnerable, so lost. Ethan had always been the strong one, the one who knew how to keep it together, to be the rock. But now, he sounded like a boy who had lost his way. "I don't know what to do anymore, Mom," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to fix this. I'm just stuck." Helen's chest tightened as she listened, the weight of her son's words pressing down on her. She had never imagined a day when Ethan would be the one asking for her help, asking her for guidance. This wasn't the Ethan she knew, the one who had always been so sure of himself, so determined. Now, he sounded fragile, broken in a way that Helen had never imagined. "What's going on, Ethan?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm, though inside she was struggling to keep the tears at bay. "What do you mean, stuck?" There was a long pause on the other end, the silence so thick it felt like an eternity. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his words coming out in a rush, as though he had been holding them in for far too long. "I don't know how to choose between you and Sophia," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love you both, Mom, I always have, but it feels like I'm being torn in two directions. Sophia needs me, but so do you. She's my wife, and I promised her that I'd stand by her. But you're my mother. You've always been there for me. And now I'm losing both of you." Helen's heart broke at the sound of his voice, filled with so much pain. She could feel his internal battle, the weight of the impossible decision he was facing. Her son was caught between two women he loved, each of them pulling him in different directions. She had never imagined it would come to this, to feel like she was standing in direct opposition to the woman he had chosen to marry. "I never wanted you to choose, Ethan," Helen said softly, though the words felt heavy in her mouth. "I never wanted you to have to choose between me and Sophia, but you can't just ignore respect. Respect is the foundation of any relationship, and it's not about what she wants or what I want. It's about what's right. It's about what's fair." "I know, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "But it's hard. Sophia says I have to choose her. She says if I don't, we can't be happy together. And I can't just let her go, Mom. I can't. I've already lost so much of her because of this, and I don't know how to fix it." The guilt in his voice was suffocating, and it threatened to break Helen's resolve. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him it was going to be okay, that everything would work itself out. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. It couldn't be. She had already given everything she had for Ethan, for both of her sons, and now she had to choose between forgiveness and her own self-respect. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I understand you're caught in the middle of this. I know this isn't easy, but you have to see that I can't just ignore how Sophia has treated me. This isn't just about her feelings or mine, it's about how we treat each other. I've spent my entire life making sacrifices for you. I did it all so you could have a better life. But I can't let someone come into my home and disrespect me, not after everything I've given." There was a long silence before Ethan spoke again, and when he did, his voice was thick with tears. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this." Helen's heart ached as she listened to her son, his vulnerability raw and unfiltered. The love she had for him was immeasurable, but her need for respect was equally as important. She had fought too hard for her peace, her dignity, to let it slip away now. "I'm not ready to forgive Ethan," she said, her voice steady, though it trembled with emotion. "Not yet. You have to understand that this isn't just about making things right with Sophia. It's about you respecting me, the woman who has always been there for you, no matter what. I'm not asking you to choose me over her, but I am asking you to see the value of what we had, and what we've lost." Ethan was silent for a long time, his sobs faint in the background. Helen could feel the distance between them growing, the emotional gap widening as the conversation continued. She didn't want to push him away. She didn't want to be the cause of his pain. But she knew that sometimes the hardest thing to do was stand firm in the face of love. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try, Mom. I'll try to fix this. I don't want to lose you, I promise, but I don't know how." Helen swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had wanted so much more for Ethan, for him to understand the importance of family, of respect, of loyalty. But all she could do now was wait and hope that someday he would find his way back to her. "I'm here, Ethan," she said softly, though her heart was breaking. "I'll always be here, but you have to understand you can't expect to have it both ways." With those final words, Helen hung up the phone. She sat in the silence that followed, the weight of her decision heavy on her chest. She had stood her ground, but at what cost? The rift between them was now a gulf, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. Helen sat in the quiet of her kitchen, the dim light of the evening casting shadows across the countertops. She had spent most of the day in a fog of emotion, still reeling from Ethan's call earlier. It wasn't just the words he had spoken. No, it was the unspoken truth behind them, the painful realization that the son she had raised, the son she had fought for, was slipping further and further away from her. She had made the decision to stand her ground. She had drawn the line, and now she felt the weight of that choice with every passing moment. Ethan had to choose, but so did she. And as the days passed without him returning her calls or showing any signs of reaching out, she began to wonder if that choice had cost her more than she had imagined. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ringing of her phone. Helen glanced at the screen, surprised to see a number she didn't recognize, but the name attached to it was enough to make her heart skip a beat: Sophia Parker. She hadn't expected a call from her, not after everything that had happened. With a deep breath, Helen accepted the call. "Hello," she said, her voice calm but guarded. There was a pause on the other end, and then Sophia's voice, soft, almost fragile, spoke, catching Helen off guard. "Mrs. Montgomery, it's Sophia." She hesitated, as though the words she needed to say were caught in her throat. I know you're probably not expecting to hear from me. I don't even know where to begin." Helen's fingers tightened around the phone, her chest tightening with an uneasy mix of curiosity and skepticism. She wasn't sure what Sophia was trying to do, but after all the tension, after everything that had been said, Helen wasn't ready to trust the woman who had caused so much pain. "I'm listening," Helen said cautiously, keeping her tone even. She was prepared for anything at this point, but she wasn't about to give Sophia any leeway until she knew exactly what she was dealing with. "I want to apologize," Sophia said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and I know I've acted terribly. I shouldn't have pushed you like that, and I know I hurt you. I'm really sorry for how I treated you, for moving things around in your home, for not respecting you. I wasn't fair." Helen listened closely, her heart racing in her chest. Sophia sounded sincere, but something in her tone made it clear that this apology wasn't as pure as it seemed. The words felt rehearsed, as though Sophia was saying what she thought Helen wanted to hear, not necessarily what she truly felt. Helen let the silence stretch out, waiting for Sophia to continue. When she did, the shift in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. "But I don't think I deserve to be blamed for everything," Sophia added, her voice now tinged with a hint of defensiveness. "I was just trying to make a home with Ethan. I didn't mean to upset you. And well, I think you've been a little harsh with him, too. He's just trying to make things work. He's been stuck in the middle of all of this, and it's really been hard on him." Helen's grip on the phone tightened, her patience wearing thin. This wasn't an apology, it was an attempt at manipulation. Sophia wasn't fully owning her actions, wasn't taking responsibility for the way she had disrespected Helen. Instead, she was shifting some of the blame onto Helen, trying to paint herself as the victim in this mess. "I know things have been difficult for Ethan, but that doesn't mean I should just accept being disrespected in my own home," Helen replied, her voice steady, though her heart was beginning to race. "I have always supported him, always put his needs above mine. But Sophia, I'm not going to pretend like what you've done to me is okay. I've been patient. I've tried to be understanding, but respect is the cornerstone of any relationship. I can't just let that slide." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Helen wasn't sure if Sophia was going to say anything else. But finally, Sophia spoke again, her voice softer, almost pleading. I know, I don't expect you to just forgive me right away. But Mrs. Montgomery, I really do want to make things right. I don't want this to come between me and Ethan anymore. I want to fix things with you if you'll let me." Helen took a deep breath, her mind racing. She wanted to believe Sophia. She wanted to believe that the woman standing on the other end of the line truly regretted her actions. But Helen knew better than to rush into forgiveness when the wounds were still fresh. And Sophia's words, while an apology, were still laced with justifications, with attempts to downplay her own behavior. "I hear what you're saying, Sophia," Helen replied, her tone cool but not unkind. "But your apology has to come with something more than words. I need to see that you understand what you did wrong. I need to see genuine change, not just an apology because things aren't going your way. I can't just pretend it's all okay. This isn't just about making amends with me, it's about rebuilding the trust that was broken." Sophia's voice faltered, but she didn't give up. "I get that, and I will prove it, I swear. I just want Ethan to be happy again, and I don't want to lose him. I've made mistakes, and I'm ready to make it right." Helen paused, contemplating her response. She wasn't ready to let Sophia off the hook so easily, but there was a part of her that wanted to believe this could be the beginning of something better. The emotional toll it had taken on her to get to this point was immense, but she couldn't let her guard down just yet. "I'll need time to see that, Sophia," Helen said firmly. "And if you really want to fix this, you need to show me that you understand what went wrong. I can't just accept empty promises. If you're serious about mending things, it's going to take more than words." Sophia didn't respond right away, but when she did, her voice was quiet. "I understand. Thank you, Mrs. Montgomery. I'll prove it to you, I promise." Helen didn't respond. She just ended the call, setting the phone down with a heavy heart. She wasn't sure where this would lead, but one thing was certain. Sophia was going to have to do more than apologize. She was going to have to show her, prove that she could be trusted. And only then would there be any hope for reconciliation. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting soft rays across the wooden floors of the house Helen had built with her own hands. It was a peaceful scene, the kind that had become rare in recent months. The quiet hum of life continued around her, birds chirping outside, the kettle bubbling on the stove. But Helen felt a weight pressing down on her chest, a lingering uncertainty she couldn't shake. It had been a long week since Sophia's call. Helen had carefully considered her words, her response, her decision. The emotional toll had been heavy, and despite Sophia's initial apology, Helen couldn't forget the way things had played out. The subtle manipulations, the blame shifted onto her. Sophia's actions had left a scar in Helen's heart, and even though her son, Ethan, was lost in his own struggles, the pain of betrayal still lingered. But today was different. There was a knock on the door, a soft, tentative knock that echoed in the silence of the house. Helen felt her heart flutter in her chest, unsure of what to expect. It had been a few days since their last conversation, and the tension still hung in the air, thick and unresolved. When she opened the door, standing before her was Sophia, holding a small bouquet of flowers in her hands. Her posture was different this time, not the confident, almost arrogant stance that Helen had become accustomed to, but something softer, more humble. Sophia's face, usually guarded and defensive, was now open, vulnerable even, and for the first time since their complicated relationship had begun, Helen saw a glimpse of something she hadn't expected: sincerity. "I know I've done a lot of damage," Sophia said, her voice quiet but steady. She handed the flowers to Helen with a tentative smile. "I wanted to bring these as a small token of my apology. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I do want to make things right if you'll let me." Helen hesitated, her fingers brushing the cool stems of the flowers, feeling the weight of the moment. The woman standing in front of her was different from the one who had once walked into her home with cold eyes and critical words. Sophia seemed smaller now, more fragile, as though the facade had finally cracked and left behind the woman who had been hurt by her own insecurities. "I've been thinking about everything I said and everything I did," Sophia continued, her voice now laced with regret. "I didn't respect you, Mrs. Montgomery. I thought I was just standing up for myself, for my marriage, but in the process I hurt you. And I can't take that back. I know I can't, but I am truly sorry." Helen took a deep breath, her chest tightening. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Sophia to admit her faults so openly, so honestly. The words felt like a balm to the wounds that had festered between them, but they didn't erase the years of tension, the subtle digs, the silent battles fought behind closed doors. "I was defensive," Sophia went on, her eyes meeting Helen's with an intensity that spoke of a real internal struggle. "I thought you would never accept me. I thought you would always be in Ethan's life, in our life, telling him what to do. I let my insecurities get the best of me, and I pushed you away because of it. I know that's not fair. You didn't deserve that." Helen felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. For a moment, she was silent, taking in Sophia's words. This was the apology she had been waiting for, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure if she could accept it fully, not yet. The fear of being hurt again, of letting her guard down only to have it broken again, gripped her heart. "I'm not asking for you to forgive me right away," Sophia said, almost as if reading Helen's thoughts. "But I want you to know that I realize what I've done, and I will prove to you that I can be better. I want us to have a real relationship, Mrs. Montgomery. I want to be part of this family, but I can't do that unless I'm honest with myself and with you." Helen stood there, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She had fought so hard to protect her dignity, to stand her ground. And now, as she looked at Sophia, she felt torn. Could she let her in? Could she trust that this was real, that Sophia's words weren't just another attempt to smooth things over? "You've hurt me, Sophia," Helen said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I've spent my whole life building this home, this family, and I can't just forget what's been done. But I can see that you're sincere, and I'm willing to try to see if this can work. But it's going to take more than just words. It's going to take real change. I need to see that you understand what it means to respect me, to respect this house, and to respect my place in Ethan's life." Sophia nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I understand, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I don't want to lose Ethan because of this. I don't want to lose you, too." Helen took a deep breath, her emotions swirling in a tumultuous mix of relief, fear, and uncertainty. She wasn't ready to forget, but she was willing to try. Sophia's apology wasn't perfect, nothing could be, but it was the first step. And for Helen, that was all she needed for now. "All right," Helen said, her voice firm but soft. "We'll take it one day at a time, but you have to prove to me that you can change, and that's going to take time." Sophia smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "Thank you, Mrs. Montgomery. I won't let you down." As Sophia left, Helen stood in the doorway, the bouquet still in her hands. She wasn't sure what the future held. She didn't know if she could ever fully trust Sophia again. But for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this could be the beginning of something new, a rebuilding of bridges, a mending of broken bonds. But Helen knew one thing for sure. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would take time, patience, and a lot of effort from both of them. But she was willing to try, for Ethan, for herself, and maybe for the possibility of a family restored. The air in the house felt different now. For the first time in months, there was a sense of peace, a quiet stillness that hadn't existed since Ethan and Sophia had moved in. The tension that had weighed so heavily on Helen's heart was still there, but it was now tempered by a tentative hope. Sophia had come to her, admitting her mistakes, offering an apology, genuine or not. It was a step forward. But Helen knew that words, no matter how heartfelt, could only go so far. Words couldn't heal the wounds that had been inflicted over months of disrespect. Words couldn't restore the sense of peace she had lost in her own home. As she sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, Helen reflected on what had just happened. Sophia had acknowledged her faults, and though Helen had heard sincerity in her voice, she wasn't ready to forget. Not yet. She had been through too much, sacrificed too much, for her to let this go without laying down clear rules. The doorbell rang, pulling Helen from her thoughts. She knew who it was. She had asked Sophia to come by this afternoon to discuss what came next, What would happen now that they were trying to rebuild a relationship, however fragile it was? When Sophia stepped into the room, her expression was a mixture of humility and anticipation. She held her hands clasped in front of her, as though waiting for Helen to guide the conversation. But Helen wasn't going to make it easy. She had been too passive for too long, and it was time to take control. "Sophia, I've been thinking about what you said," Helen began, her voice steady but firm. "And I'm willing to move forward, but I need to make one thing clear. There are boundaries, rules, if you will, that need to be respected in this house. My house." Sophia nodded, her eyes never leaving Helen's face, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "I've worked hard to build this home, Sophia," Helen continued, her voice unwavering. "And I've spent my entire life taking care of my family, but I will not allow this house to become a battleground, not anymore. This is my space, and I will not tolerate disrespect, not from you, not from anyone." Helen paused, watching as Sophia absorbed her words. She needed to make sure Sophia understood the gravity of the situation, that this wasn't just about moving past the hurt. This was about rebuilding trust and respect. "First," Helen said, her voice growing more determined, "you and Ethan need to understand that this house is not a free-for-all. Ethan and I have lived here for years, and we have our routines, our ways of doing things. If changes are to be made, whether it's with the furniture, the daycare, or anything else, you need to ask. You need to consult with me first. This is not about controlling you, but about respect. We're sharing this space now, and that requires compromise." Sophia opened her mouth as though to speak, but Helen raised her hand, stopping her. "I'm not finished," she said. "Second, I want to make it clear that this is a space where respect is the foundation. Ethan and I have lived here for years, and I've earned my place in this house, just as you've earned yours by marrying my son. But that doesn't mean you get to dictate what happens here without considering my feelings. There will be no more moving my things around without asking, no more disregarding my space. We are equals in this house, and that needs to be respected." Sophia nodded again, her face serious. She was listening, but Helen wasn't sure if she truly understood yet. This wasn't just about changing the way things were done. This was about restoring the balance that had been lost between them. "Third," Helen continued, her tone now softer but no less firm, "if there's an issue, anything at all, we talk about it. No more passive-aggressive behavior, no more pretending it's not a problem. If you're upset with something I've done, you come to me. If I'm upset with something you've done, I will come to you. But we don't let things fester. We talk it out like adults. If we have to, we can even get outside help. But we don't let things boil over into bitterness and resentment." Sophia looked down at her hands, her expression thoughtful. It was clear she was processing everything Helen had said. This wasn't a conversation she had been expecting. She had come here for resolution, to smooth things over, but Helen was laying out a map for what came next, one where Sophia was going to have to meet certain expectations. Helen leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter now, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Lastly, Sophia," she said, her eyes locking with hers, "I need you to know this. I will always love my son, but I cannot allow myself to be treated like a guest in my own home. I am not asking you to be anyone's servant, but I am asking you to respect me. If we are going to make this work, it starts with that." Sophia was quiet for a moment. Helen could see the battle inside her, the desire to push back, the instinct to defend herself. But instead of arguing, Sophia simply nodded, her shoulders sagging slightly, as though a weight had been lifted from her. "I understand, Mrs. Montgomery," she said, her voice soft. "I know I've been wrong. I've let my insecurities take control. I'm sorry, and I'll respect the boundaries you've set, I promise." Helen studied Sophia for a moment, her expression unreadable. She wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that Sophia was truly remorseful, that this apology was genuine. But Helen had learned the hard way that trust was something that had to be earned over time. "I appreciate that," Helen said, her voice warm but firm. "But remember, this is about actions, not just words. I'm willing to give this a chance, but I need to see change. I need to see respect. Only then can we rebuild what's been broken." As Sophia nodded, Helen felt a flicker of hope, small, but there. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was in control again, that her home could once again be a place of peace. It was the first step in what would be a long and difficult road. But it was a step forward, and that was all Helen needed for now. The day after Helen laid down her rules, a strange quietness had settled over the house. There was a tension in the air that wasn't just the usual unease. It was the weight of something shifting, something that had been broken but now had the potential to heal. Helen had never been one to shy away from confrontation, but as she sat at her kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, she felt something stirring inside her. Ethan had to face the reality of what was happening. And she knew that no matter how much she wanted to believe things could go back to normal, they would only get better if Ethan was ready to acknowledge what had gone wrong. It was late afternoon when the knock came at the door. Helen knew it was Ethan before the sound even registered. His knock wasn't the same forceful one that had echoed through the house during their last argument. This time, it was tentative, softer, as if he were unsure of how he would be received. Helen stood up slowly, her heart beating faster than she expected. She had been waiting for this moment, yet now that it was here, she felt an odd mixture of relief and anxiety. She opened the door, and there he stood, Ethan, looking more like the young boy she had raised than the man he had become. He was disheveled, his eyes tired, his shoulders slumped. He was no longer the confident, sure young man who had once walked into her house with pride. Now, he seemed small, fragile, like someone who had been through a storm and was still reeling from the aftermath. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice soft, almost as if he were speaking to a stranger. "Can we talk?" Helen nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He walked slowly into the living room, his gaze flicking nervously around the familiar space. It was the same room where they had shared countless evenings together, where laughter had filled the air and memories had been made. But now it felt different, colder, emptier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. They both sat down, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking a lot, Mom," Ethan began, his voice strained. "About everything, about you, about Sophia, about the way things have changed." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I know I've messed up. I let Sophia's influence take control. I thought I was doing the right thing by defending her, by making her happy. But I didn't realize what I was sacrificing in the process. I didn't see the damage I was doing to you." Helen listened quietly, her heart aching as she watched her son struggle to put his feelings into words. There was no anger in his voice, no defensiveness, no excuses. There was only raw emotion, and for the first time in a long while, Helen could see the Ethan she had raised, the one who had always been considerate, thoughtful, and kind. "I've been blind, Mom," he continued, his eyes welling up with emotion. "I let her pull me away from you. I chose her over you without even realizing it. And I hate myself for it. I didn't appreciate everything you did for me. I didn't understand the sacrifices you made. You've always been there for me, always loved me, and I just let it all slip away. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." Helen's heart clenched as she heard the sincerity in his voice. But even as her emotions swelled, she knew this wasn't enough. Ethan's words were a start, but they were just that, a start. The healing couldn't happen overnight. It couldn't happen with just an apology. "You're right," Helen said quietly, her voice steady but filled with a quiet power. "You've always been my pride and joy, Ethan, but you've also hurt me. And I won't just forget that because you say you're sorry. You can't take back the way things have been. The way you let her walk all over me. You can't erase what happened with just words." Ethan's face twisted with guilt, and for a moment he looked like he might collapse under the weight of it. His shoulders slumped, and he looked down at his hands in his lap, his fingers fidgeting nervously. "I know, Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's not just about saying sorry. I know I have to show you that I've learned, that I've changed. I don't know how to fix it. I've made so many mistakes." Helen took a deep breath, her chest tightening. She could feel the crack in her heart, the fracture that had formed over time, and as much as she wanted to reach out and tell him it was going to be okay, she knew it wasn't that simple. Healing didn't come quickly, and it didn't come without effort. "I'm not asking you to fix everything overnight," Helen replied, her voice calm yet firm. "But what you've done, it's going to take time. You're going to have to prove to me that you can change, that you understand why this all happened. And I need to see real effort, Ethan. It can't just be words." There was a long silence, and Ethan nodded slowly, his face etched with regret. I understand, Mom. I really do. I'm ready to prove it to you. I'll do whatever it takes, just please don't give up on me. Please don't walk away from me. Helen's heart ached as she looked at him. She could see how much he was struggling, how deeply he regretted the distance that had grown between them. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw the possibility of healing. I won't give up on you, Ethan, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. But you have to make the effort, too. You have to show me that you understand what's at stake here, that you understand that love isn't just about saying the right words. It's about action. It's about respect. Ethan nodded again, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that brought tears to Helen's eyes. This wasn't the end, but it was a beginning of change, of understanding, and maybe, just maybe, of a mended relationship. I will, Mom, he said, his voice filled with conviction. I will, I promise. It was early evening when the knock came. This time, it wasn't the familiar, forceful, desperate knock from Ethan, nor the defensive, cold taps from Sophia. It was a softer, hesitant knock, uncertain but earnest. Helen stood at the kitchen counter, her back to the door as the evening light filtered in through the window. For a moment, she almost didn't want to answer. There was something about this moment that felt like an ending and a beginning all at once. Could she really let them back into her home, after everything that had transpired? After all, she had set the boundaries. Ethan and Sophia had been given the space to prove themselves, and now they were asking for forgiveness. She had made them understand that healing couldn't be rushed, that it wouldn't come with empty apologies. It would take time, patience, and more than a promise, it would take real action. The knock came again, a little louder this time. With a deep breath, Helen set the cup down on the counter, wiping her hands on the apron she still wore from the day's chores. She had already made up her mind. She had fought for too long for her own peace, and if she was going to open the door to her son and his wife again, it was going to be on her terms. When she opened the door, there they stood, Ethan and Sophia. Ethan looked different, his face still lined with worry, but his eyes seemed clearer, more present. The weight of the situation had aged him somehow, but there was a tenderness in his gaze now, one that hadn't been there before. Sophia, on the other hand, had a quieter, more vulnerable demeanor about her. Her usual defiant stance was replaced by something softer, almost apologetic. She held her hands in front of her, clasped together as if to steady herself. For a brief moment, Helen stood in the doorway, observing them both. The house she had built brick by brick, the space that had once been her sanctuary, was now a battleground of emotions, missteps, and broken trust. But something in her heart told her this could be the turning point, the moment where they all began to heal, if she allowed it. You came, Helen said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. We're here, Mom, Ethan spoke first, his voice quieter than usual, the sound of vulnerability evident in the way he said it. I know I've messed up, but we want to make things right. I want to make things right. Sophia stepped forward, her eyes meeting Helen's with a hesitance that was new. She didn't offer a flood of words this time, as she had in the past. She simply said, I'm sorry, Mrs. Montgomery, I know I've hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I want to start over. I want to make amends. Helen studied her, nodding the sincerity in Sophia's voice, the way she stood without the defiance that had once been a part of her. For the first time, she saw a woman who was truly humbled, who understood the gravity of her actions. Helen took a slow breath, her hands resting at her sides. She wanted to say so much, wanted to tell them how much they had hurt her, how much it had cost her to get to this point. But instead, she opened the door wide enough for them to step inside. Come in, Helen said softly, stepping aside to let them through. Her words were simple, but they held meaning that said they were welcome, but only under the condition that they would respect the rules of this house from here on out. As Ethan and Sophia crossed the threshold, Helen could feel the weight of the moment, the fragile hope that had settled between them. It was a quiet kind of reunion, no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures. Just two people who had hurt each other, now willing to take the first step toward healing. They sat down in the living room, the same place where so many uncomfortable conversations had taken place over the past months. Helen took a seat across from them, her posture straight, her demeanor calm but with a strength that wouldn't waver. "Let's talk about the rules," Helen said, her voice steady. She wasn't going to sugarcoat it. She wasn't going to pretend everything was okay just because they were sitting here asking for forgiveness. This was the time for action, not just words. Sophia nodded, her eyes downcast, her hands still resting on her lap. Ethan leaned forward, listening intently, waiting for his mother's words. "First," Helen began, "this house is my space. You're both welcome here, but you need to respect my space. You need to respect my things, my way of living. If there's something you want to change, anything, you talk to me first. We make decisions together, not just you two. This isn't a dictatorship. This is about respect." There was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of doubt. Ethan met her gaze and nodded slowly, acknowledging her words. Sophia didn't speak, but she kept her head lowered, as if absorbing every word. "Second," Helen continued, "if we have a disagreement, we talk about it. No more passive-aggressive behavior. No more shutting each other out. We work through things like adults. If that means seeking outside help, we do it. But we don't let things fester." Sophia lifted her eyes then, her gaze more resolute. "I understand, Mrs. Montgomery," she said quietly. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. I want to build something, but it has to be based on respect." Helen could hear the sincerity in Sophia's voice, and for the first time in months, a flicker of hope sparked in her chest. "Lastly," Helen said, her eyes resting on Ethan, "you, Ethan, need to know that I am your mother. You don't have to choose between me and Sophia. But you do need to understand that I won't tolerate disrespect. You need to defend me too when it matters. It's not about taking sides. It's about being fair and being a family." Ethan's face softened, and for the first time in a long while, Helen saw the son she had raised, the one who had always stood up for her, the one who had always known where he came from. "I understand, Mom," he said quietly. "I promise I'll do better. I won't let this happen again." There was a silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes before something new, a turning point, a fresh start. Helen looked at both of them, the realization settling in. This wasn't going to be easy. It would take time, and there would be bumps along the way. But they had taken the first step, and that in itself was enough. "I'm willing to give this a chance," Helen said finally. "But you both need to show me that you're serious. No more mistakes, no more hurt." They both nodded, and for the first time, Helen felt a sense of calm. She had opened the door, literally and figuratively. Now it was up to them to walk through it with her. Mornings felt different now. The house, once a place of quiet tension and unspoken hurt, had begun to shift into something else. A space where people once divided were learning to coexist again. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. There were still moments of discomfort, subtle reminders of how far they had come and how much further they had to go. But in the small changes, the ones that went unnoticed by the outside world, Helen could feel the first stirrings of peace returning to her life. Sophia was the first to step into the role of housemate, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to be part of the family again. It started with simple gestures, taking the initiative to clean the kitchen without being asked, making sure the coffee was ready for Helen in the mornings, taking out the trash without fuss. Little things that spoke volumes about her willingness to change, to be someone that Helen could rely on. At first, Helen watched her closely, unsure if the changes were real or temporary. She knew better than to trust words alone. But over time, Sophia proved her sincerity, and Helen began to feel the weight of the old wounds lift, if only a little. Sophia's efforts didn't go unnoticed. Helen had raised her son to be respectful, but it was Sophia's actions that showed she had learned the value of respect in ways words could never convey. Ethan, too, was different. There was a quiet attentiveness in the way he moved through the house now. He was more present, more considerate of Helen's needs, and more aware of the small things that had once gone unnoticed. He no longer spent hours with his head buried in his phone or the newspaper, tuning out the world around him. Instead, he was sitting with Helen at the kitchen table after dinner, asking about her day, truly listening. He no longer assumed that Sophia's comfort should come before his mother's. He was learning to balance the two. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Ethan, Sophia, and Helen, there was a quiet peace that settled over them. The conversation was light, but there was an underlying warmth that hadn't been there before. Sophia was laughing at one of Ethan's silly jokes, and for a brief moment, Helen found herself smiling, genuinely happy to see the change in her son and his wife. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, small miscommunications, old habits trying to resurface. But these moments were easier to navigate now. The foundation they had all worked so hard to rebuild was still fragile, but it was sturdy enough to stand on. Later that night, as Helen sat in her favorite armchair, sipping her tea and watching the soft glow of the lamps around the room, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The turmoil, the pain, and most importantly, the lessons she had learned. It hadn't been easy. Nothing about this process had been simple. But in the end, she had reclaimed her dignity, her space, and her sense of self. She had learned that respect was the cornerstone of any relationship. That, no matter how much love you gave, no matter how much you sacrificed, if respect wasn't there, everything else would crumble. Helen had always known the importance of sacrifice in a family, but she had learned through these difficult months that self-preservation wasn't selfish. It was necessary. If she had continued to compromise herself for the sake of peace, she would have lost everything that mattered. As Ethan and Sophia began to adjust to the new rules, Helen couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in her ability to stand firm. She had fought for her family, but in doing so, she had also fought for herself. She had set boundaries, not as walls to keep others out, but as markers to protect the integrity of what truly mattered. The house wasn't just a building anymore. It was a home again, one that was beginning to feel like it was whole. And in this new chapter, Helen realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning from it, using it to build a better future. She wasn't naive. She knew that challenges would come again. But for the first time in a long time, Helen felt ready to face them. She had learned to prioritize her own well-being, to advocate for herself, and to show her family that love, while essential, could only thrive where there was mutual respect. As the evening went on, the house hummed with a quiet harmony. Sophia and Ethan were cleaning up after dinner, laughing as they worked together. Helen sat back, content. The battle was over, but the journey was just beginning. There would still be moments of struggle, moments when the past threatened to resurface. But for now, she allowed herself to bask in the small victories. The family, though scarred, was finding its way back to each other, one day at a time. The soft rays of the morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. Helen sat by the window, her cup of coffee cradled between her hands, staring out at the garden she had tended to for so many years. The flowers were in full bloom now, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dull gray days that had once clouded her home. The garden, like her life, had undergone a transformation, one that had come with time, patience, and the willingness to heal. As Helen looked back over the difficult months, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of peace settle in her heart. The road to this point had been long and hard, filled with pain and heartache. The rift between her and Ethan, the tension with Sophia, the confusion and anger, all of it had tested her in ways she hadn't expected. But now, as she sat here, the weight of it all seemed to lift. Ethan and Sophia had changed. And though Helen hadn't thought it possible, she too had changed. She had learned to stand firm in her beliefs, to set boundaries without fear of losing the people she loved. She had learned that while love was essential, respect was even more important, and that it was okay to put herself first when the situation called for it. Her relationship with Ethan had been tested, and though it had been a painful journey, it was now stronger. He had learned the hard way that family couldn't thrive without mutual respect. And Sophia, once a source of tension, had shown her willingness to change, to apologize, and to meet Helen halfway. They had all made mistakes, but they were working to rebuild something new, something better. Helen took a deep breath, letting the quiet of the morning seep into her. The house, once filled with tension, now felt like a real family space again. It was still hers, still the home she had built with her late husband Andrew, but now it also felt like it belonged to all of them. There was a sense of belonging that hadn't been there before, a quiet understanding that they were in this together. Ethan had been spending more time with her lately, sitting down with her for dinner, asking about her day, and genuinely listening. The distance that had once grown between them was closing, brick by brick, like the house she had built with her own hands. Sophia had started helping around the house without being asked, contributing in small but meaningful ways. The house was a place where everyone could find their space, and each other, without the weight of unspoken resentments hanging over them. There were still moments of awkwardness, of course. Old habits were hard to break, and sometimes the past would rear its head, reminding them of what had come before. But now, those moments were dealt with calmly, respectfully. They talked through the issues, and if they couldn't agree, they found a way to compromise. There was no more fighting, no more yelling, no more silences that stretched on for days. Helen smiled softly, her heart swelling with a bittersweet mix of love and pride. She had done what she needed to do. She had fought for herself, for her family, and for the dignity she deserved. And though the path hadn't been easy, it had led them to this place, a place where respect and understanding were the foundation, where love could grow without fear of being trampled. As Helen sat back, letting the peace of the morning settle in, she knew that this was only the beginning. There would always be challenges. No family was perfect, and no relationship was without its struggles. But now, Helen had the strength to face whatever came next. She had learned that her dignity was worth more than anything, and that sometimes you had to take a step back, stand your ground, and let things unfold in their own time. Her home, once filled with tension and heartbreak, now felt like a place of warmth, of second chances, and of quiet hope. She had come to realize that it wasn't about perfection, it was about growth, and about choosing to move forward together. And as Ethan and Sophia walked into the kitchen later that morning, laughing softly as they shared a private joke, Helen felt her heart swell with a quiet joy. They were finally learning what she had known all along, that family was built on love, but it could only survive with respect. They had all learned that lesson the hard way, but now they were ready to move forward. With Ethan and Sophia by her side, Helen knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Not perfectly, not without flaws, but with an understanding that family was worth fighting for, that love was worth protecting, and that respect was the cornerstone of it all.